Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Jamansky with Purdue Extension here in Perry County, Indiana. I'd like to welcome you to our September Small Ruminant webinar. Today, we're excited to have Dr. Stacy Zuelly with us today. She is a meat science specialist at Purdue University on campus. Dr. Zuelly was raised in a diversified livestock operation in Holly, Michigan. She received her Bachelor of Science in Animal Science from Michigan State University. She continued her meat science education by earning a Master of Science from the University of Kentucky and a PhD from the University of Illinois. She joined the faculty at South Dakota State University in 2011 as an assistant professor. In August 2015, Dr. Zuelly joined the Department of Animal Science at Purdue University as an assistant professor with an extension and teaching appointment. Her extension and teaching focuses on meat science with particular interest in fresh and processed meat quality and bridging the gap between animal agriculture and food production. So with no further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Stacy.
All right, I'm unmuted now. Now you can hear me. I've taken off my gag, although I can't take off this mask because we are in Purdue and I've got my backup crew here, my camera crew is doing an amazing job, but unfortunately we got to leave the masks on because we're still inside. But so first of all, welcome. Hope you're having a happy lunch, depending on the time zone you're in. And I like to make this kind of just, it's a general, all around kind of meat science discussion in relation to meat. To lamb, pardon me. And I was a sheep person growing up, and prior to going to college, honestly, I knew nothing about meat science. I knew we dropped our lambs off, came back about a week later, and they were in nice little packages, and that was about the extent of my meat science knowledge. So it's been a great opportunity over the years to be able to reach out to all kinds of different people and talk about that, again, connection between that live animal and what we're actually going to be putting on the plate for people. So unfortunately, we don't have any full lamb carcasses. We'd have to be in the cooler for that one. But we have a well-preserved lamb carcass here that I'll be addressing here in just a second. So I guess the first thing I want to talk about is really our various cuts of meat that we have. And I want to focus this a lot on something I've been hearing quite a bit during our pandemic. I think it was around before, and don't get me wrong, I think direct marketing and whatnot really lends itself nicely to the sheep industry. Because we have that opportunity to be a little more connected with our consumer and, quite frankly, our product. I don't want to say it's a niche product, but it's obviously more of a specialty type item. And so lamb in general lends itself very nicely to being directly marketed. However, I've noticed during the pandemic, just from the calls that I've gotten, just how many more people are really focusing on being able to put, a whole animal, whether it be a pig, lamb, or cow, in the freezer so that they have that item to go to when we have strains on our supply chain, like we've seen in the last several months. So I think just that security has been really kind of ramping up everyone's awareness of being able to do direct marketing. And I think that's great. And I love it. My family did it too, or we still will sell a lamb to a neighbor or to a family friend or what have you. And that's awesome. But I think sometimes you need to go into that with an understanding of really what is that person getting on the other end. And so that's what I want to kind of talk about here. And I love having questions, so I want to make sure we're going to end in plenty of time to make sure we can address any questions you guys might have. Now, I did send a PowerPoint that Sarah's going to share a link with you. There's two. There's a PowerPoint and also a handout that I think are really helpful. I'm not going to stick right to that PowerPoint. It's just a lot of the general information I'm going to be giving. And so if you're one of those people that likes to just kind of enjoy a webinar rather than take a lot of notes, feel free to take a look at either one of those files. Hopefully they'll be helpful to you. So let's talk about what we're actually going to get out of a lamb carcass. And a lot of this is probably review for some of you who have, harvested your own lamb or sold a lot of cuts. I'm going to bring my well-preserved lamb carcass over here into view. I don't think we need to use the overhead, guys. I think we'll be okay. I can tip it up. And they've got a beautiful overhead camera. We'll use that here in just a moment. But here's my lovely, well-preserved lamb carcass. Half of one, right? Don't want to lose my papers here. So when we kind of move from front, this is, of course, our neck over here, to rear, our leg on this side, it's important to notice we have really four major cuts that we get out of a lamb carcass. We have our shoulder, we have our rack, which is going to incorporate these ribs right here. We have our loin, and then, of course, we have the leg. And all of them have great qualities to them. There's two rules of thumb, regardless of species. I always like to remind people when you're thinking about what you're going to get from an end product. First rule of thumb is anything from the limbs is generally going to be less tender or definitely less consistent in its tenderness because those are muscles that had to move every day. They had to get this animal up to go to feed, to run away from their neighbor, to do whatever they wanted to do in their everyday life. So that means that those muscles have built up a lot more of the protein that we call collagen, and it means they're a little tougher. Doesn't mean they still can't be delicious. It just means that we have a lot more variation in tenderness, and generally they need a little bit more love on the cooking side of things. So that's where stuff out of your limbs usually lends itself very nicely to be used for roast, right? A leg of lamb roast, we think about that during the holidays, maybe a shoulder roast, things that are going to go in a crock pot or in an oven for a long period of time. And that length of time allows those proteins to break down and become softer and more palatable over time. So that's one of the first rules of thumb that we have to remember. The second rule of thumb that we have to remember is that in general, our livestock species are going to fatten from front to rear. So anything out of that front limb is generally going to, or front half, pardon me, is generally going to have a little more fat to it. And the stuff as we move towards the back is going to be a little leaner. So why do I care about that? Well, fat brings some things to the table, pun intended, that it's going to make and improve our juiciness, and it's also going to give us some flavor. Now, this is where I'm sure you've probably heard some people say, oh, but lamb is so gamey, right? Honestly, when we look at American lamb, we get that comment a lot less. Yeah, lamb has a different flavor sometimes, but American lamb is much more mild. Now, this is not taking anything away from my international people, right? I know that New Zealand and Australian lamb, they really have the corner on the market as far as being able to have the quantity, right? But when we look at the quality of lamb, we definitely see some differences there. And a lot of it comes back to that fat, right? We have a different type of fat with our American-based lambs just because of how we manage sheep here in the United States. It's not saying one's better or worse, they're just different from one another. But why do I care about then, again, that idea of fat? Because again, that helps me understand what I should be doing when I'm cooking things. In general, mind you, an entire lamb carcass is a lot trimmer or has a lot less fat than, let's say, a pork carcass, and a little less than in a beef carcass. So that means we need to be, again, cognizant of the fact that we can actually dry this out if we go too lean with stuff. So where we focus on a lot of our attention most of the time then is those middle meats, right? Those lamb chops. Now I'm going to have the guys use the overhead camera here in just a moment, but let me put my glove on just to save me some time from letting my hands get icky. And I've got 3 of our different type lamb chops that we have. 2 of them that are going to come out of our middle meats. Whoop. Again, our rack and our loin. So this is a rib chop. Whoop, whoop. Oh, you move. Okay. Switch cameras on. Oop, that's not the one I want to move. There we go. Now you can switch camera. So this is our rib chop. So you can see the nice rib that we've got right here. And this muscle right here is our ribeye. And why do I want to come back to that muscle is we're going to talk about this one again. That is known as the ribeye, or if you want to get real scientific and impress some people, it's called the long distance dorsai. But that's the longest, most continuous muscle in the carcass. And it's the primary muscle that makes up a ribeye chop and also a loin chop, as we'll talk about here in just a second. Now, if we can go back to my other picture for just a moment, gentlemen. Thank you very much. They're so good at fading in and out. Aren't they wonderful? So if you can imagine this loin chop, or this rib chop, pardon me, laying just like this, right? This is where that rib chop came out. So when you're looking at your lambs and you see down their top, we talk about having a heavier muscle top and things like that. What you're really trying to evaluate is that ribeye muscle, because if you can imagine, I took it right out here. So this is the very top of what you see on a live animal. Oh, if we can go back to my thank you. So this is the very top of what we see on a live animal. And so this muscle, and mind you, we have 2 of these, one on each side. So this right here is where we split the backbone down the middle. And so if I had another rib chop, it would go on the other side. So you'd have another muscle right here and another rib over here on this side. So when you're looking down the top of your lamb, when you've got a really nice, thick, heavy muscled lamb, what you're really trying to evaluate is, again, the size of this ribeye muscle. This one's a very nice, very average, probably slightly above average ribeye that we have on this particular lamb. So those are our rib chops. As we move a little bit further back then and look at the next set of chops that are very common, these would be our loin chops that are right here. So again, that ribeye muscle starts up in this shoulder, actually right here. It lays right here, right kind of in that corner where the ribs meet the backbone, right? It lays right here. And then when we get back here, it's still laying on top of these vertebrae right here. So this is my loin chop, and this is where this one comes out, right? And if I can, we'll go back to my overhead camera. Thank you. So this is still where the backbone, I kind of orient it. There we go. So this is the chop that was taken in the rib section. This is that same muscle right there, that, again, longissimus dorsi or ribeye, whichever you want to call it. But now this is just a little bit further back. So rather than having a rib for a bone, it's got that lumbar vertebrae, the lower back part of the vertebrae, right? And the other important muscle that's peeking up then as well is this muscle that's on the bottom, which is known as the tenderloin. So it's one of the reasons why a loin chop tends to be a little more satisfying, because you're actually getting two really great muscles. You're getting this ribeye on top, and you're getting this nice little tenderloin. So that's the same muscle, just totally different places. Here's up over the ribs, and this is one that's on the portion of the back, or I'm sorry, the lower portion of the back, or again, the loin. And chops are great. If you're direct marketing of people and you kind of get that customer, it really says they want to have kind of user-friendly things. I highly recommend they make chops out of this middle portion. I would not go with roast. I'd say make some chops out of these. And then that's where I kind of like to tell them to shade away from doing many roasts. Roasts take a little bit more time. They're, I don't guess, unuser-friendly, but you just have to have a little bit more thought into them. Because if I take a chop out of this front shoulder, which I have one right here, I have two actually, but this is one out of my front shoulder. Just a second. So this one actually came out. There's slide this back. Let me get this out of the way. So this is a chop that was taken out of the front shoulder. Immediately, when you compare this one to these, notice how many more muscles I have in that chop. Every single one of those muscles has a different profile to it. Some of them are tender, some of them are not, some of them are flavorful, some of them are not. So the problem with stuff out of your shoulder, and the same thing holds true in the round, or I'm sorry, not the round, the leg. You can tell I've been teaching this week. I've got all of my beef cuts in my mind. But when it comes to the front shoulder, notice we have a lot of little muscles. The only thing that would be different if I had some cuts out of the leg is they're just bigger muscles. There's fewer of them, but they're bigger muscles. But regardless, we have a lot more than what we have in these middle meats. Notice these middle meats, like this rib chop, really all I have is that one muscle. In my other one, I just got these two main muscles. I got one little extra guy hanging out here, but these are the two main ones. So here I only have 1 to 2 muscles, so I don't have a lot of variation. When I'm talking about stuff out of a limb, I've got a lot of variation in there. Pardon me. I'm gonna cough. Just allergies, I promise. I've gone through my COVID test recently, so I'm good. But when you have all that variation is when, again, they become a little less user-friendly. So to be honest with you, most of the time, if I've got somebody that says, hey, I really want to make something that's a little easier for my consumers to be able to go ahead and just, pull out, throw on the grill, simple seasoning and things like that, I say make sure you do the middle meats into chops. And maybe take those shoulders for sure, sometimes the shoulder and the leg, and go ahead and grind those. You can end up getting a lot more ground lamb. I personally love pushing people towards, not pushing, encouraging people to go with a little more ground lamb. Because honestly, ground lamb has a really nice flavor to it. And let's face it, ground meat, you can use it almost anything. You can make it into sausage. You can make it into meatloaf. You can make it into burgers. You can do all kinds of stuff with it. Actually, the one that I still like to chuckle about is I made sloppy joes for my husband. I think this was before we were married. He's the pickiest eater I've ever met in my life. And I made sloppy joes for him, and I did not tell him they were lamb because he'd always told me he would never eat lamb until after he ate them. And I was like, what'd you think of my sloppy joes? He's like, those are really good. We didn't try that again. I was like, okay, cool. I'll make sure I get some more lamb out of the freezer. Now, he eventually started talking to me again, but it did take him a little bit. But ground product is a great way to kind of get people interested. And that's another thing. If you happen to be doing like farmers markets or something like that, or maybe you've got some people that are just, I don't know if I want to buy a whole lamb, start them out with ground lamb. If you start them out with ground lamb and they realize, wow, this is great, it tastes good, it makes nice burgers and stuff like that, it's got a great flavor, it's a great gateway meat to kind of get people to maybe consume a little bit more lamb on a regular basis. So these are, like I said, my cuts. The major cuts, again, are going to be the shoulder, the rack, the loin, and the leg. Now, there's some additional cuts down here on the bottom. You can find them sometimes in your retail cases, not very often, because to be honest with you, the percentage of edible product, of meat to bone, isn't awesome. So a lot of times your processor will go ahead and just trim those out for you. And again, I always love that. I encourage that because I try to get as much ground product when I get lambs processed as I can. I just find that a lot more, manageable. Especially now that I've got 2 little kids, being able to sit there and watch a roast all day is just not going to happen for me. Now, another thing that I like to encourage people to try is definitely try to maybe, this is going to sound bad, limit the amount of seasoning that you use with lamb. Why do I say that? Specifically, I should say when you're using American lamb. If you look at most of your lamb recipes out there, they call for really, really aromatic, really strong flavors. Mint is always the thing people think, mint jelly. You can't see him, but my cameraman just did this. Like the side. So mint is really common. Rosemary, thyme, really, really strong and aromatic flavors, which aren't necessarily bad. But why those were traditionally used in lamb recipes was basically to mask the flavor of lamb. Because historically, we would usually eat more older lambs or, again, import lambs that were more grass-fed. And so the flavor was a lot stronger. Anymore, a lot of your American lamb is a very mild flavor. And so, quite frankly, it doesn't need that. So whenever you're telling people or maybe cooking things yourself, when it comes to lamb, I like to stick to really simple flavors. Salt and pepper are always things we recommend when you're dealing with meat. Salt, not only will it obviously give you the salty flavor, but salt actually has an additional property as well. Salt actually helps extract muscle proteins. Don't worry, I'm not going to get too sciencey on you. But what that means is that basically it lets meat stick together better. So particularly if you're doing a sausage, or if you're making like a burger or a meatloaf or something like that, when you add salt, it really helps those proteins stick together. It gives you a better texture. Pepper, of course, just kind of helps add some depth to your flavor. And then the other 2 that are really important in any meat seasoning are the ones we call our savory twins, which you probably already guessed, but that's going to be garlic and onion. And so honestly, people ask me again all the time, what kind of seasoning do I use when I'm dealing with lamb? Stick to those 4 basics. Now, if you want to add a little rosemary or a little thyme or this, that, or the third, feel free. Stick to those 4 basic ones, and you'll be surprised if you only use those 4, how delicious it can be. I'm going to pick on Dr. Neer. He has me come and help with his lamb class, usually in the spring. Of course, this past spring, we weren't able to do it. And they do a little lamb cook-off. And I told the students, I'm like, guys, because so I get to judge it. So I told them, I said, be careful. I said, I don't like a lot of thyme. I don't like a lot of rosemary. I said, just think about that when you're looking up recipes. And sure enough, there was a group that did a lamb stew, and it was pretty good. But instantly, I could taste the thyme. And I looked at them. I'm like, so how much time did you add to this one? And they're like, oh, my gosh, she figured it out. I'm like, yeah, it's almost like I've been doing this for a lot of years, you guys. So anyway, I recommend, again, going a little less on the seasoning for your fresh cuts. Now, that leads me into that idea then of, well, what if I want to get some stuff processed? And I highly recommend that as well. If you can get like a lamb snack stick, lamb summer sausage, it can be phenomenal. It's also a great way to sometimes use, not necessarily those animals that are cull animals, that are really old animals, but if you've got a yearling or something like that, they'll tend to not maybe have like the greatest fresh cuts, but see if you've got a processor that'll make them into sausage for you. It can be really, really good. My family, we always love doing summer sausage and snack sticks. It's a great, great way, again, to have kind of that convenience item. So again, if you're doing, let's say, farmers markets, or if you're just trying to get your neighbors or stuff like that, or customers, having like a snack stick or a sausage or something like that they can easily eat and be like, oh yeah, this tastes good, is a really good idea. Now, the problem when you're doing a market ready lamb is you don't get a ton of trimmings. Okay. Again, that bottom half of the carcass that I mentioned, we'll trim that out unless you sacrifice something like, let's say, the shoulder. Again, that's usually the first thing I go to. I almost always sacrifice the shoulder. I'm like, I don't want chops like this. I just don't care for them as much. I'd much rather have simple little chops like this. This, grind it up, give me some sausage, right? That to me is a better trade-off. So that's one thing to consider is if you're going to get a lot more sausage, like I said, you got to take it from somewhere. And that's one of the unfortunate things with lambs. We only have so much stuff. Now, when you're getting things processed, if you do decide, if you say, you know what, I want the shoulders, but I want to go boneless with the shoulders, you will end up getting a little bit more trim. Because whenever we make something boneless, we will end up having little pieces of meat that normally would have been left on there that just happen to get cut off. So it's a trade-off, right? When you go boneless with something, you're not getting it in the roast. It's not like the meat's evaporating and going somewhere. It's going, though, over into your ground product. And that actually leads me into another item that I want to discuss. It's on there, and there's a handout as well. It says, what is it? How much meat should my customer get? Because for people who are starting to do direct marketing, one of the first things I always get asked, they're like, well, or I should say, one of the first complaints I always get is people say, oh, they stole some of my meat. I dropped off a 120-pound lamb, and I did not get 120 pounds of meat. Well, yeah, that's going to happen because we lose some things along the way. So, first off, let's start at the beginning. When you're weighing, or if you're selling your lamb based on weight, I highly recommend you use a carcass weight, if your processor will give that to you, rather than a live weight. Or if you are doing the live weight at home, make sure you weigh that lamb when they're empty. That's going to be a more realistic weight for your customer. Another thing to think about is when you're weighing them is how much fleece is on them. If they're really heavy in their fleece because they're more, we're in the fall or something like that, as opposed to being in the summer, they might have a little longer fleece, might have a little more vegetation. If you're using a live weight, I'm not saying that the live weight is inaccurate. It's just that it's accounting for the whole thing, and we know we're going to take that hide off. And we know we're going to take those guts out during the harvest process. So that's something to consider. I always tell people, if you can try and sell your lambs based on a carcass weight, you generally are going to have a happier customer, because a carcass weight is a much truer representation of what you're really going to get and take home from a product standpoint. Then when we think about how we encourage people to cut up their various products, and I've kind of already alluded to this already, probably the biggest thing that will really deter or change the amount of products, the amount of packages you take home, is whether or not you go bone in or boneless. Now, generally, our cuts out of the middle meats, our rib and our loin, we leave those bone in. To make them boneless, you'd really lose a lot. But the shoulder or the leg, again, you can either grind them, or if you want to leave them as roast, you can go boneless. If you're doing that, if you're removing those bones, you're removing weight. It's not like you lost anything edible portion-wise, but you are losing weight. So if somebody, let's say, last year they went completely bone-in with everything, and this year they decide to do some boneless stuff, they need to anticipate that the pounds of packages they're going to bring home are going to be lighter. It's not because you cheated them or that the processor took anything from you. They just removed the bone like you asked them to. So bone-in versus boneless is huge. And then the other thing with that is really that composition of the animal. If you've, pardon me, sorry. If you've got a really fat lamb, of course, they're going to trim it down however you specify. And so that can also really deter or alter that amount of edible product that a person gets to take home. So just some things, all of that is outlined in the handout that says how much product are my customers going to get, or what do my customers get? I think there's 2 PDFs. That's one of them. The other one's a PowerPoint slide. It just kind of walks through that idea of, again, dressing percentage and then what we get from a cutting yield. And it's not perfect, but at least it gives you some things to think about whenever you think you're maybe direct marketing, or again, if you're going to start selling it, some retail shop or at a farmer's market or something along those lines, things to consider in that respect. Now, one thing that I'm sure is pretty universal, I've seen it definitely across the Midwest, I think it's going across the U.S. pretty consistently during our pandemic, is we've had a huge strain put on our small processors. And probably you guys have noticed this if you're getting stuff processed. I know people here in Indiana, a lot of my small processors, they can't get custom harvest stuff done. Now you're booking appointments into next year already, even though we're in September, October. And not all processors will do this, so I'm not going to speak on their behalf, but I do know some processors that have been much more willing to help people out in the harvest process. They'll get it cut and then they'll give them a price break if they'll just take the meat and package it themselves. So that's where I have my little other stuff that I've got here to talk about meat packaging. So if you want to be able to meat package, or if again you happen to be able to get in a situation where your processor might give you a price cut or something like that for packaging, I wanted to show you guys how to properly package meat so that we make sure we don't end up ruining our product. So what I've got here is just simple butcher paper. You can get this from the grocery store. It's usually with all the saran wrap and the, down that aisle where the saran wrap and the foil and all that fun stuff is at. And it should have a plastic coating on one side. Yep, you can see how it's nice and shiny on one side, and it's dull on the other. Okay, so the plastic coating is the one that needs to be touching the meat. So whenever you're packaging, and I'm going to use my little chop that I have here. First off, these bones, of course, can be sharp. So using a little saran wrap on there, or honestly, just I could rip a piece of this and put this on there to kind of help double it up. That'll help keep my package. Thank you. There you go. So I can double this up, and that's going to help from these little rib bones anytime you got a bone-in product from poking through. So the next thing you're going to do, I'm going to take my gloves off so I can make a clean looking package for you guys, is you want to bring your paper up to the top, like so. And I think this guy's actually going to work a little bit better if I turn him. There we go. Yeah. There we go. So I'm going to bring my paper up to the top. Come on. There we go. I just centered it. That's all I was doing. So what we're going to do then is you're going to fold it over once, only about a half an inch or so, and give it a good crease. And then I'm going to roll this all the way down. And essentially what we're doing is I'm pushing all the air down in the package. So once I get it down nice and tight, now I need to get the air out of the sides of the package. So you push down on both sides, give it a nice little fold over, and another fold. Now this is where a lot of times people stop right there and say, oh, then I'll just fold it up like this. That actually gets you more, leaves some air in the package. What you need to do then is flip it over. So flat side up, and then I'm going to push, you may or may not can tell, but I'm actually going to push in with my hands as well. And by doing so, I'm pushing the air out. So now you can use, honestly, you can use packing tape. You can use a good masking tape if you want, whatever you want. And all you got to do is just go ahead and tape up this package. The only place where air can get out is right here on the end. So as long as you put a good piece of tape there, it's actually completely, has all the air removed and air can't get in. That's good. When air gets into a package, it can actually cause dehydration, and it gives us some freezer burn. So we want to make sure we've got all that air pushed out. So it should be a nice tight package like this. And I should be able to feel kind of my product all the way around the edges and everything. That's when you've got a nice, good, tight package. This is usually a really nice and cheap option. Butcher paper isn't very expensive. It's a little more labor intensive because you really need to make sure you get that package done, like I said, properly. And then from this angle, I just want to show you how I did that again, just in case it was lost in the overhead view. I don't think it was, but just in case. So again, you bring it over, you can do a nice seam, you roll that sucker down, and we end up again pushing the air out this way. Now we got to push the air out that's on the sides. So we just fold it over once or twice, flip it over, and then again, you can just tape it. Now, I recommend having a good packing tape because if you use like Scotch tape or something like that, the adhesive on those does not hold up to freezing. So you want a good packing tape that can hold up to that freezer for you. And again, that's just a great way to be able to have a nice, easy package. And I've had, like I said, a lot of processors recently that are like, look, I can cut it and kill it, or kill it and cut it for you, but if you'll package it, it saves them a lot of time. Because imagine them having to do that themselves. It just takes time and the packaging materials. So again, not all of them will do it, but if they will, I wanted to be able to give you that opportunity. The other one then, if you've got a little bit more investment, is if you want to invest in a vacuum packager. So this is what a lot of your processors will use. And if you've got a processor that will do vacuum packaging, I highly recommend it over the white packages. Not picking on the white packages at all. However, of course, it's paper. So it's far more likely to puncture with, again, a bone, or when you're getting it jostled around, it's easier for it to rip and things like that. Whereas a nice vacuum package bag is less likely to do that. In the end, honestly, the science between the two of them is identical. We're trying to get as much oxygen out as possible so that we actually have a product that lasts longer in the freezer. Just like as I started, though, these are also able to be punctured. So if you've got something with bones in it, as I have here, I recommend taking a piece of saran wrap or, again, a piece of the paper. That's an easily makes what we call a bone guard. And let's see, can we go over how to get this? And so I've just got the one bone there, so I'm just going to go ahead and wrap that up on that side. You don't have to put this on there, and this doesn't look as nice when you use white paper, so you could easily use saran wrap too. And so I'm just going to go ahead and throw this guy in my vacuum package bag. Oh, if I can get my vacuum package bag open. Actually, this is one of the things I recommend is if you can take a vacuum package bag and roll the ends like so. That's going to become important here in just a second. That makes it easier, wider mouth in order to get this product in there. And again, I don't love using the white paper as my bone guard unless it's for me. If I'm selling it or giving it to somebody else, I like to use plastic, like a ceramic, and then it's clear and it doesn't look as bad. Right? But a couple of things when you're using a vacuum package bag, though. First of all, you want to make sure you get all the wrinkles out, so just give it a good tug. That's going to lay this nice and flat. You want the top and the bottom piece of plastic to be able to adhere really easily. We want to make sure our product is nice and far away, and you want to make sure that wherever your seam is going, where it's going to do a little heat seal to seal the oxygen out or air out, you want to make sure that's really clean. So doing the rollback method like I just did helps to kind of save you that if I go back and roll it back out. So when I roll it back like this is where my seam is going to be at. And like I said, no meat will touch it when it goes in. So it keeps it nice and clean. So when you unroll it then, I've got a nice clean place in order to put in my vacuum packager. I'm going to bring my vacuum packager over here. I want to get the logo out of there because they're not paying me. So why should I advertise for them? And so when you're looking at your vacuum packager, there's generally a well or something like that, and it tells you this is the vacuum channel. So you need to be able to have the end in there. That's where the air is going to be able to come out. This particular one, I'm going to go ahead and grab that and just tell it to. What am I doing this one? So you can see that the air is coming out. Shrinks it up nice and tight. This one happens to be automatic, but I just go ahead and tell it. Yeah, start sealing. The more air you can pull out, the better. Now, if you've got something like ground product, be careful because the purge or the juices that can come out of this can make their way towards your seal. And again, I'll make it so that it doesn't seal properly. All right, and this is good to go. And you can see I got a nice seal there. And again, this is where this is gonna last longer in a freezer situation. When you remove that oxygen like that, you've got a much better product that'll last longer from a freezer burn standpoint. When you get freezer burn is when this package busts or you get a hole punctured in this and you get a dehydration. And once it dehydrates like that, I don't care how much liquid you try to pour on it, it's not going to rehydrate. The proteins have let go of the protein and they're not going to take it back. So that's where, again, if you have that opportunity to be able to do some packaging on your own, it can save you possibly and allow you to be able to maybe get your product into the processor a little earlier. If they'll do it. And again, it's a little more labor intensive on your part, but at the same time, it still gets meat in your freezer. So that's a good thing too. So I'm going to open up to questions here in just a minute. And I guess if you've got questions, please feel free to start typing them in as I kind of touch on my last main point here. And then we'll kind of do as much interactive as we can. And if there's something I missed or went too fast on, please let me know, and I'll be happy to review. But that does bring me back to that idea of your processors. So being a meat science extension specialist, I work with our small processors all the time. There's some really great people out there. They're doing a lot of work, and particularly this summer, a lot of strain went on them when all of a sudden our larger plants, of course, shut down or couldn't function because of COVID. And so I highly recommend having a strong and good relationship with your processors as best you can. And that's working with them as you maybe want new products, if you want a new snack stick or you want a new sausage or something like that. But also having a clear set of expectations. If you are going to look into doing, more direct marketing, or you're going to be looking to have more retail settings, or you're going to be doing things at, let's say, a farmer's market or something like that, having a really good communication with those folks is going to be critical. I don't really see, again, we've seen this kind of push towards people saying, oh, well, maybe I should just go to my local place rather than go to the grocery store. I think that's going to be around for at least another year. We're going to see ramifications of this, if not longer. So I think maintaining a strong relationship, and I'm not saying, mind you, that all of them are maybe the perkiest people to work with, because they've been trained just like everybody else. But I think having a good communication and set of expectations, how many lambs you want to have, what's the turnaround, what's the cost, when do you need to get those appointments booked to make sure that you always have product for your various things that you might need. Not always awesome, not always the most fun thing to have to open that line of communication, but really critical, because again, that just portion of our industry right now has been really strained, as it has been. All of our industry has been very strained, but again, being a livestock person, I know when I was a livestock person, I really never thought much about what the processors were doing, but it's a pretty big important part, and we need to sometimes, again, just open that door of communication so you got clear expectations. So look over my peanut gallery there. Do we have any questions? Or you want me to just keep rambling? I'm good at rambling.
If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box.
A lot of times I get asked questions about, I'm just rambling then until you guys ask questions. Oh, we got one? Oh, I have one.
How long does fresh lamb last? How long does
Ooh, good question. How long does fresh and frozen lamb last? So fresh, if it's in a vacuum package situation like this, you're probably good for at least about a week or two. Depends on who processed it. And why I say that is because the cleaner the processing and all that jazz, the longer something lasts, right? So the more care people take, the longer it will last. So in a fresh situation, you're probably fine for at least 1 to 2 weeks. In a frozen situation, honestly, you shouldn't brag about this, but I've had stuff in my freezer for like a year to 2 years sometimes. Usually we say 6 months, 6 to 12 months is usually what we recommend. And that's not from a safety standpoint. That's purely from a quality standpoint. If you put something in your freezer and it's in there for more than a year, it will start to deteriorate in its quality. So it's not that it's bad for you, right? It's not going to harm you if you pull out something that's 2 years old out of the freezer. If it stayed frozen the whole time, it's fine, safe-wise. It's just that it may have dehydrated and stuff, so it might not have the greatest flavor. If particularly it's in a freezer where it kind of got in a freeze-thaw situation, right? Sometimes our freezers will defrost on you, and so you'll get kind of some warm spots for even it stayed in refrigeration, still stayed frozen, but it got a little warmer frozen. Basically what will happen in that scenario is your ice crystals within your meat will have melted and reformed. And every time an ice crystal reforms, it's like a little knife that just cuts into your meat product, kind of making it a little more like Swiss cheese, and so you lose more moisture. So that's, like I said, those are more quality issues than they are safety issues. Is that your question, Phil? Oh. Any ones?
We do have another question. One person asks, can you revisit the 4 seasonings you like to use?
Sure. The 4 seasonings, sure. So in any meat, the 4 main seasonings that I highly recommend you use: salt. Usually, if I'm going to make like a base rub that I can just use for a variety of different things, I usually start with a half a cup of salt. Now, some people say, well, should I use table salt? Should I use kosher salt? Iodized salt by itself can tend to get a little bitter. So if you're one of those real, flavor connoisseurs, I do recommend using a non-iodized salt. Otherwise, honestly, table salt's just fine. If you're like, hey, salt to me, then okay, then you're fine. So I usually start with about a half a cup of salt. Then I will use about a tablespoon of pepper. And so for pepper, a question I get a lot of times, well, should I use coarse ground pepper, white pepper? All pepper is the same. The difference in them is the particle size. So white pepper, very, very fine particle size. Your peppercorns are the largest ones. And so you got variations in there, right? You got regular pepper, regular mild grind or fine grind. Then you got coarse ground pepper. Then you got peppercorns, right? When you have a smaller particle size, then you actually use a little less of it. Reason being is, so like I said, if I'm using just plain black pepper, regular, like I said, table pepper, right? I use a tablespoon of that. If I'm using white pepper, I usually only use about a teaspoon or maybe a teaspoon and a half. The reason being is when the particle size is smaller, you actually get a better coverage. So that's why the flavor tends to seem like it's a little more intense, because you're getting a better coverage of it. So same thing goes when we talk about our two savory twins, which are onion and garlic. So for those, I add, because I love both of those, I add like a heaping teaspoon of both of those to my standard rub. So it's a half a cup of salt, a tablespoon of pepper, and then a heaping teaspoon of garlic and onion. Same thing with those. If you're using onion or garlic powder, or if you're using granulated, right, you need to adjust. So I use generally, that's a granulated when I say use a teaspoon. Okay, if you're going to use a powder, you use a little less than that. And again, that's simply a particle size thing we got going on. If you use like the dried minced stuff, which I'm not a huge fan of because I don't feel like it gets a good coverage, you use even more. I would say at that point, maybe you need to do 2 teaspoons, pardon me, of that. But those are your the 4 things you need in your base: salt, pepper, garlic, and onion. After that, I honestly will put that in a container. I leave it in like a Tupperware container, have it in my cupboard, and that's always my base seasoning that I use. And then let's say tonight I'm like, oh, hey, I want to make something that's more Italian. Okay, I grab a little basil, a little oregano, boom, I've got Italian. Or if I'm like, hey, I feel like making something that's more like Mexican or something, I take some scoops of my base and I add some cumin or maybe a little bit of chili powder or something like that. So you can start with that base, and then you can honestly kind of make it whatever you want. You can even make it into like a jerk seasoning where you add some allspice and cinnamon and things like that. So that base, though, is a really, really good base that works with the savory flavors we're trying to get in our meat products. Hopefully that answered your question on that one. Other questions? Do you have more?
Yes, we have a question. I have Kiko meat goats. If we do our own butchering, what can you share about aging the meat before freezing or after, and how?
Good question. So aging of meat, is that right? That's what I heard properly?
Yes.
So, okay. What does aging do? Aging is really important, particularly in cattle, because what aging does is it actually allows the natural enzymes within our meat to break down the muscle proteins. And so in doing that, it actually ends up improving the tenderness. We also get some flavor development as well. It tends to kind of give it a little more intense or richer flavor. Now, when you're talking about this with beef, it's really important because we know beef are older animals. They tend to have more connective tissue. So in general, beef is tougher than lamb. And so it's really important for beef from a tenderness standpoint. In lamb's already pretty tender, to be honest with you. Of the 3 main species, lamb is probably the most tender. I'm probably biased on that one, but that's okay. So from a tenderness standpoint, we don't necessarily need it. But again, it can actually help maybe from a flavor standpoint. Where I tell people to be careful with that is that the longer you age out a carcass, you're going to lose some moisture. The outside of the carcass will start to dehydrate. So if you think about it, you're kind of concentrating the flavor and whatnot. That means you're also concentrating your price because you're going to get a little less product out of it. So that's perfectly fine. If you're willing to give up a couple percent of your carcass in moisture because you want to be able to have that better palatability, go for it, right? Now, in particular in beef, probably the biggest thing that I generally recommend is when people are going to age stuff. First of all, let me back up. This is where you have to work with your processor as well, because if your processor, sometimes they really need to have a certain turnover. If you want to age something longer, you need to make sure that they know that and they can do that. Sometimes they'll tell you, hey guys, I need that cooler space. I can't leave something in there for 3 weeks. So that's one thing to, again, have that conversation. Particularly on beef, so I'm getting back to what I'm saying. One of the easier things then, if you've got a processor that's like, look, I can't wrap up that much space in my cooler, what I'll tell people to do is just take out those middle meats, right, or something like that, and have those get aged. And then that way, the stuff you're going to get ground anyway, the shoulder or leg or whatever you might be getting ground, go ahead and let them do that. Let them cut that up. So from a processor standpoint, all I'm doing is having to age some cuts rather than an entire carcass. For beef in particular, that's really important. And I'd say the same thing would hold true in lamb. If you're going to go ahead and if you want, something aged, I would take the time and investment to age your middle meats. I would not think it's as valuable to your wholesale cuts on the end, your shoulder and your leg, because again, a particular shoulder, as I've mentioned many times, I go ahead and just say grind up the shoulder. So I wouldn't want to waste the time and lose, right, some of my meat by letting it dehydrate. I say go ahead and make that stuff into sausage, put that in the freezer while those middle meats hang out in the cooler and maybe break down a little bit more. Now, if you are somebody that really does like the leg, again, you can go ahead and say, hey, age the leg as well. But that can sometimes be easier. So if it's in a package, that's fine. It can age. We call this, when you're basically packaging it like this and putting it in the cooler, we call that wet aging. Dry aging is the one where you just leave it out to the elements. That one tends to lose a lot more moisture. So dry aging is usually the thing people think of the first. Wet aging is one that's kind of a happy medium. It's generally easier on the processor because, again, it doesn't take up as much as their space. But you don't necessarily get quite the same flavor development. But you will get tenderness, which is nice. So when it comes to aging, again, dry aging, where we're just letting it hang out in the cooler, great for tenderness, great for flavor, not so great for your overall cutout. Wet aging, where it's in package form, good for tenderness, okay on flavor, really good from your cutout standpoint because you're not going to lose moisture. So again, both of them work well. We use them, like I said, a lot. It's a much more important issue in beef, no offense to the sheep, because I think, quite frankly, they need it more. Lamb doesn't need as much help with tenderness as beef does. So,
Stacy, could you speak to aging with goat meat? Could it have the potential for enhancing an off or a flavoring goat meat?
So the question is on goat meat and kind of, you're saying offsetting the goat flavor. Is that the question?
Accenting or making a stronger goaty flavor in the meat.
I'm gonna first of all, before I even start talking on this one, I'm gonna fully acknowledge my ignorance when it comes to goat. I've only had goat a few times, so I'll be completely honest with you guys and not make it seem like I eat goat every day. I will say, from a goat standpoint, I think you will get an intensity of flavor. Again, the other thing to talk about, lamb and goat in relation to beef are going to be very different in that aging, also because of the amount of fat. Lamb and goat has a lot less fat. When you have less fat, you're not getting quite the same flavor development over time, which is a good thing, I think, because I don't think you'll get maybe kind of some of those off flavors you can get when you age things. So with goat, if you were to age goat, I don't see it, or lamb, I don't see it being overly intense in flavor, right? It's going to get the flavor will change probably, but I don't see it probably getting overly intense because it is so lean. Where I would be concerned with aging goats from a dollars and cents standpoint is, again, goats have less fat on the outside of the carcass. And so if you do a dry aging, I would be very concerned about the amount of product you're going to lose because it's going to dehydrate on the outside. So not to say that it's not a very viable solution to use. Again, basically, the root of my answer is I don't know. To me, it would make sense that it will probably not alter the flavor much to dry age it. But my bigger concern with dry aging goat would be that you might lose some more product off the outside. Because once the carcass dehydrates on the outside, again, just like freezer burn, I can't just add some water and bring it back and rehydrate it, right? It's not a chia pet. I can't make that come back. So so you really don't want to, sorry. They like my joke on the chia pet. So having a carcass that just leaner like goat is. Let's face it, lambs and goats are very lean, but goats even leaner. I would really worry about the amount of product loss you'd have with that one. So if I were to age goat, I would probably say to use a wet aging method where you go ahead and let them cut it up. It's in packages, and then it just hangs out in a refrigerator until it goes into a freezer. I think that'll help get you the benefits of some tenderizing, maybe a little flavor development, without killing your pocketbook and losing a lot of your product. Other questions you guys can think of?
Is there any benefit of cooking a bone-in roast versus a boneless roast?
Yeah, there is. There's some people that say bone-in roast can give you a little more flavor. One of the nice things about bone-in, when they're left bone-in, is that bone can kind of help you from overcooking it at times as well. And so there's definitely some flavor and textural things that we'll get along with leaving the bone in there. Probably, like I said, the biggest one I see with consumers a lot of times is it just helps them from overcooking, and temperature is huge. And oh gosh, my grad students would be remiss if I didn't talk about my favorite piece of equipment that everyone should have whenever they're cooking meat, and that is a meat thermometer. I don't care how good you are. A meat thermometer will tell you more truth in your cooking than anything else. And that's not just from a safety standpoint, because of course we want to make sure our products get safely to the right temperature, but it's also from a palatability standpoint. The example I always use, and maybe you've heard this one before, where people say, oh, just cook it till the juices run clear, then you know it's good to go. And I've had students do that on a variety of different products, burgers, brats, chicken breasts, and it's crazy the amount of temperature range you get. So I'll give students a piece of meat and I say, cook it till the juices run clear, and then check the temperature on it. And they'll do that. And I've had temperatures as low as 120 degrees and as high as 220 degrees. So you have this group of people that have got stuff way not safe. You've got some people that got stuff that's way, way overdone and really, really not good flavor-wise or palatability-wise. And you got this really small population that got that happy medium. And so when it comes to our whole muscle cuts, we can cook those in all the way down to a rare degree of doneness, which would be like a 140 to 145 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're talking about ground product, a burger, a sausage, anything that we change the particle size and mix it up, those have to be cooked a little higher to like 160 to 165. Because a whole muscle cut, the inside of the muscle is sterile. So all we're really trying to do is kill the stuff on the outside. When we ground it up, right, we brought things from the inside or outside to the inside, so we don't know what's in the middle. So that's why we always say a ground product needs to be higher. And so whenever let's see if I got, oh yay, you're on my little here. This is like my own cooking show. But whenever you're checking the temperature, first of all, invest in a good set of tongs. So if this is your meat product, what a lot of times people will do is they'll just stab the meat in the top and check the temperature, and that's not right. Whenever you're checking the temperature, you want to use a nice set of tongs. Pretend this is a grill. You pick it up off the grill and you insert the thermometer from the side, right, into the middle portion of the meat. When you come in from the top, it's way too easy to go too shallow or too deep, and then you're towards the outer edges. I want to know what the coldest place is. And so going back to the original question of the bone, again, that bone can sometimes help to where you're still cooking it to a safe degree of doneness, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, it helps keep you from going too far and overcooking it. So it's important, like I said, to have a good temperature so that you don't overdo it, because you'll end up just drying out your product. And I realize everybody likes their products at different temperatures. Some people are like, I like a rare steak. Some people want one that's well done. They're wrong, but that's okay. But everyone's entitled to their own opinion. And so it's important to make sure, though, from a temperature standpoint, that will tell you a more truthful representation of what you have. If you use the color of the meat, which a lot of times we do, or if you use the texture, some people like push on it and they're like, oh yeah, I can tell it's done. That one's medium. Those will lie to you sometimes. And a lot of times, actually. And they're those are very subjective measurements, right? So use a meat thermometer. That's always my first recommendation for anybody. Use a meat thermometer. It will save you so much. It'll vastly improve your overall eating experience, and it makes me feel better from a safety standpoint too.
Okay, we have another question.
Sure.
What portion of the lamb or goat is best for making jerky?
Oh, very good question. Okay, so when you're making jerky, you're going to be drying out your product. So you generally want a leaner product. This is where goat, you can honestly use stuff out of the shoulder because, again, a lot of times a goat's pretty lean. But if you've got a fatter type animal, I always recommend go for stuff out of the leg. I know that sounds blasphemous that you're getting rid of stuff in the leg, but anything from that back half of the carcass. So the leg, the flank is another one. Honestly, the flank in lambs is really small. If you're thinking about like a beef flank is really big, lambs it's really not very big. But the reason why you want stuff out of the back half of the carcass is that it's leaner. You want leaner cuts to go into jerky. The reason being is that fat or fatter cuts will not dry the same. And one of the key things you're trying to do whenever you're making jerky is you want it to dry out, because when you've got a dry product, your microorganisms can't get in there and spoil it or rot it or make it unsafe. So I highly recommend you go for your leaner product. So if you have a leaner lamb or a leaner goat, then you can kind of use almost anything. But if you're like, I really don't know, if you stick to stuff in the hind portion, because remember our rule of thumb, they fatten from front to rear. So using stuff from the rear portion will generally lend itself to a better jerky product. Great question.
Okay, we have time for about one more question. Does anybody have a question?
So I'm biting my mask.
If not, we'd like to thank Dr. Zuelly for joining us today. Yeah, excellent presentation. And again, we have the materials that she mentioned available in this Google Drive folder that I just posted again. And the recording will be posted to YouTube tomorrow. Dr. Zuelly, do you have any last words?
Yeah, I also want to thank the two guys that are here helping us out, Dr. Scott Radcliffe and Mr. Phil Reed. They've done a great job of getting all this stuff. They make my job super easy. I just get to show up and do these fun things. They're the ones that have been working the cameras and everything. So thanks them very much. They've done a great job.
Well, have a great day. And again, everybody can be looking for this video on my YouTube channel tomorrow, and I will send it up to Phil to be posted on the Goat and Sheep channel on campus. So have a great day.
Bye, guys. Have a good one.